August 19, 1942. The thick jungles near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal were silent, except for the distant hum of insects and the whisper of the wind through palm leaves. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company wrote in his diary that day, describing the shock and disbelief felt by many Japanese soldiers as they faced the reality of the American forces. Imi and 916 other men from Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment had just landed under the cover of darkness, completing a night insertion that Japan's high command believed would mark the first step toward retaking Henderson Field. They'd been told the Americans were barely 2,000 men. Soft, poorly trained, easy to scare. Colonel Ichiki had brushed off all warnings to wait for reinforcements, confidently telling his officers, "These are Americans. We'll drive them into the sea before sunrise." But none of these battle-hardened veterans, men who had fought and triumphed across China and Southeast Asia, had any idea that they were about to experience something the Imperial Japanese Army had never known before. This wasn't just defeat, it was the complete destruction of everything they believed about war. Every strategy, every tactic, every shred of ideology. The jungle itself would turn against them. The darkness, once their ally, would betray them. The Americans' firepower, coordination, and overwhelming technology would crush the myth of Japanese invincibility once and for all. That transformation began 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 Marines from the U.S. 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. Led by General Alexander Vandegrift, they were carrying out Operation Watchtower, the first U.S. offensive in the Pacific War. Their goal seemed simple: capture the half-built Japanese airfield, set up a defensive line, and hold out until reinforcements arrived. But what awaited them was a brutal campaign that would push human endurance to its breaking point. Guadalcanal was a nightmare of heat, humidity, and disease. The island stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, with jagged mountains climbing into the clouds. Henderson Field sat on a coastal plain choked with swamp and dense jungle, where visibility dropped to just a few feet. The air was stifling, the humidity never below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in such numbers that men breathed them in. Rivers that looked clear were filled with parasites, and diseases like malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually cripple more Marines than bullets ever could. Still, on that first day, the Marines found the airfield almost deserted. Over 2,000 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops had fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and the airfield itself. By the evening of August 8th, American engineers were already working to finish the runway. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft landed, and the base would soon be home to the legendary Cactus Air Force. Japan's response came fast, and it was devastating. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a destroyer through the dark, in a surprise assault that became known as the Battle of Savo Island. In less than an hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra, were sunk, and over 1,000 sailors were lost. The remaining Allied ships retreated, leaving the Marines stranded with limited food, ammo, and supplies. Yet what Japan failed to understand was that Henderson Field had already changed everything. Whoever controlled the airfield controlled the seas by day. From Henderson, American aircraft could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles, a fact that would shape the entire battle to come. Japan could still move under cover of darkness, sending reinforcements on fast destroyers in missions that would later be called the Tokyo Express. But when the sun rose, the skies belonged to America. The Imperial General Headquarters ordered the immediate recapture of Henderson Field. The task fell to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army at Rabaul. His available forces were spread thin, 1 brigade in Palau, another regiment in the Philippines. The closest was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, originally meant for the cancelled Midway operation. Ichiki was known as a skilled tactician, confident, proud, and utterly convinced that Japanese spirit would always triumph over American firepower. Before leaving Truk, Ichiki was ordered to wait for his full regiment before attacking. But he had nothing but contempt for American soldiers. He had read reports from China and the Philippines, Western troops lacked discipline and cracked under pressure. So, on the night of August 18th, Ichiki landed 917 men at Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the U.S. perimeter. The landing went smoothly and undetected. He sent reconnaissance patrols ahead, a standard move but one that would doom his men. The next morning, August 19th, a patrol from Company A of the 1st Marines under Captain Charles Brush encountered Japanese scouts near Coley Point. A short, intense firefight broke out. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents revealing something critical. Ichiki's men believed they faced only a few hundred Americans. In reality, they were marching straight toward 11,000 well-dug-in Marines waiting for them in the jungle. Captain Charles Brush rushed back to the Marine perimeter with the captured documents in hand. General Vandegrift immediately grasped their meaning. A Japanese attack was imminent, likely from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce defenses at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tenaru River, though it was actually the Ilu. The mistaken name would stick forever in the records. Cates positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, setting up machine guns with overlapping fields of fire across the sandy mouth of the river. What was about to happen would become one of the most lopsided victories in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, refusing to wait for intelligence from his missing patrol or for reinforcements, decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th, and into the early hours of the 21st, he ordered a direct frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the strength of willpower and the power of night attacks to overcome enemy fire. Ichiki believed his battle-hardened troops could break through American defenses through sheer courage and close-quarters fighting, where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, a Solomon Island scout named Jacob Vuza, who had escaped Japanese captivity after enduring hours of torture, stumbled into Marine lines with an urgent warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the darkness exploded with gunfire. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, shouting war cries, firing rifles, and throwing grenades, running straight into a deadly trap. The Marines had turned the entire sandbar into a killing field. Their Browning M1917A1 water-cooled machine guns perfected in World War I roared to life. Each could fire 600 rounds a minute without stopping, as long as the cooling water didn't boil away. Positioned to cover every inch of the river crossing, the guns unleashed an unending storm of lead. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds, torn apart by 30-caliber rounds. Those who made it across faced 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun blasts that shredded everything in their path. The assault went on for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged through the gunfire, trying desperately to reach Marine lines. Some managed to make it through, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting broke out along the perimeter. Marines fought with rifles, knives, shovels, anything they could grab. But the American line held. Their overlapping fields of fire left no gap for the enemy to exploit. By dawn, Ichiki's attack had collapsed. The riverbank was littered with the bodies of over 800 Japanese soldiers. As sunlight spread across the water, General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. Elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, supported by 5 M3 Stuart light tanks, rolled across the sandbar to wipe out any remaining resistance. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched from behind the lines. "It was incredible," he wrote. "The tanks moved among the trees, turning, firing, sheets of yellow flame bursting from their guns. We hadn't realized there were so many Japanese hiding in the grove. They were flushed out and cut down one after another. By noon on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, roughly 800 were dead. Around 120 survivors, mostly from support units left near the landing area, slipped back into the jungle. They managed to send one final radio message to 17th Army headquarters. Their regiment had been wiped out. Colonel Ichiki was among the dead. Japanese reports claimed he burned his colors and took his own life. Some Marines swore he was killed in a final doom charge. U.S. casualties were around 40 killed and wounded. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was crushing. An entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans hadn't fought the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They hadn't panicked in a night assault. They hadn't fled before the bayonet. Instead, they stayed calm, held their positions, and systematically destroyed their attackers with coordinated, relentless firepower. Even more shocking was what the battlefield revealed afterward. American equipment and logistics were on an entirely different level. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated, and never failed from lack of spare parts. Each Marine carried more ammunition than a full Japanese squad. Their artillery support and coordination between ground forces, gunners, and naval firepower created a seamless, devastating system of destruction unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. But the fight for Guadalcanal was far from over. Within days of the Tanaru disaster, Japanese command ordered new reinforcements to the island. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto launched a massive naval operation to back the next attempt at retaking Henderson Field. On August 16th, 3 transport ships left Truk, carrying the remaining 2,400 men of Ichiki's regiment along with 500 naval infantry. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons damaged one of those transports, Japan abandoned the use of slow ships altogether. From then on, they relied on fast destroyers to ferry troops, a tactic that became known as the Tokyo Express. Between August 29th and September 4th, Japanese destroyers and light cruisers landed nearly 5,000 men of Major General Kiyotake, Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade at Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express was fast and efficient. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, avoiding U.S. aircraft during daylight hours. But it came with a fatal flaw. They couldn't carry heavy gear. Artillery, vehicles, tanks, and even food and ammunition had to be left behind. That weakness would doom every future Japanese attack on the island. By September, many Japanese soldiers were already starving, forced to live off the jungle and what few supplies could slip through American lines. Despite it all, General Kawaguchi planned a new assault on Henderson Field for September 12th. His strategy was bold, a 3-pronged strike, with one force hitting from the west along the coast and another pushing from the south, through the thick jungle, toward what they believed was the weakest point of the American defenses. General Kawaguchi planned to lead the main assault himself, advancing from the south along a narrow inland ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. What he didn't know was that U.S. Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely route of attack. On September 8, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, led a raid on Tasimboko village. There, his men discovered massive Japanese supply dumps, clear evidence that a large enemy force was gathering nearby. Edson quickly realized the Japanese would strike from the south, using the ridge as their main avenue of approach. He requested permission to fortify it. General Vandegrift agreed without hesitation. Over the next 2 days, September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned around 840 Marines, a mix of his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same deliberate care seen at the Tanaru. Machine guns were placed to overlap fields of fire. Mortar crews zeroed in on likely approach routes, and the 11th Marines registered artillery targets for immediate response. Every angle, every firing lane, every fallback position was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a 1,000-meter-long coral spine made up of 3 small hills, covered in kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, thick with jungle, perfect terrain for infiltration and ambush. If held, it could be turned into a fortress. If lost, it would give the Japanese a direct path to Henderson Field. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi launched his attack. Unlike Ichiki's disastrous frontal charge, this was a far more coordinated and complex operation. Japanese infantry filtered through the ravines on both flanks, probing for weak spots, then concentrating for breakthrough attempts. The fighting quickly descended into chaos and close range, brutal and confused. In the dark, Marines often found themselves grappling hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers who had crawled to within grenade range. But the defenses held. Whenever the Japanese massed for an assault, Marine mortars and artillery tore them apart. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 shells that night, many exploding so close to friendly lines that shrapnel wounded their own men. Machine gun barrels glowed red from constant fire. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, and even entrenching tools when ammunition ran low. Among them was Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tanaru attack. moving along the lines, directing fire and rallying men. At a crucial position, Sergeant John Basilone kept his machine gun firing even after every man in his crew was killed or wounded. He alone held the line through repeated attacks, earning the Medal of Honor for his heroism that night. In total, 2 Marines would receive the Medal of Honor for Edson's Ridge, and 19 others would earn the Navy Cross. By dawn on September 13th, the Japanese assault had failed. Kawaguchi's forces had been beaten back with heavy losses, but he wasn't finished. Determined to break through before American reinforcements arrived, he regrouped and prepared for another attack that night. Edson, anticipating the renewed assault, pulled his men back to the central part of the ridge, tightening the line. General Vandegrift sent reinforcements, raising the defending force to roughly 2,500 Marines. When night fell again on September 13th, the second battle for the ridge began, even fiercer than the first. Wave after wave of Japanese troops hurled themselves forward. Some came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being driven back. The situation grew so desperate that Edson himself took up a rifle and joined his men on the line, firing into the darkness alongside them. But once again, American discipline, firepower, and preparation carried the day. By sunrise on September 14th, the ridge was carpeted with Japanese dead. Kawaguchi's offensive had collapsed completely. Between 8:30 and 8:50, Japanese soldiers were killed in the assault. The Marines lost 104 killed and more than 200 wounded. Heavy losses, but not enough to break them. From that day forward, the ridge would be remembered by 2 names, Edson's Ridge and Bloody Ridge. For the Japanese who survived, the psychological blow was immense. Captured diaries and later accounts told the same story: disbelief and despair. They had expected to face frightened, inexperienced troops who would crumble under night attacks. Instead, they encountered a storm of artillery, mortars, and machine guns coordinated with mathematical precision. The Americans had known they were coming, waited patiently, and annihilated them. The battles of Tanaru and Bloody Ridge set the pattern for the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign. Time and again, Japanese forces relied on courage and night tactics, believing that spiritual strength would overcome American weapons. But the Marines countered with carefully planned defenses, overwhelming firepower, and tightly coordinated support from land, sea, and air. The result was always the same: catastrophic Japanese losses and hard but sustainable American victories. But numbers alone can't capture the nightmare that was jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The island itself became a weapon, killing without mercy. Malaria struck nearly everyone who stayed more than a few weeks. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division had reported over 8,000 malaria cases. 2/3 of the division were disabled by tropical diseases. Dysentery spread everywhere. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through their skin, while jungle rot left open sores that refused to heal in the damp heat. With almost no dental care, abscessed teeth and infections became life-threatening. The Japanese had it even worse. Their supply lines were a disaster from the beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive proper rations, but the Tokyo Express couldn't deliver enough. They survived on whatever they could find, stretching tiny portions of rice to last days. Starvation became a daily reality. Medical supplies were practically non-existent. Quinine, vital for malaria prevention, ran out early and was never replaced. Wounds that could have been easily treated with proper medicine turned deadly. Captured Japanese reports later revealed the extent of the suffering. One medical officer's note from October said that over 60% of the 17th Army soldiers were incapacitated by disease or starvation. Combat readiness had fallen to barely 30% of normal strength. 50 men were dying every day, most from hunger and illness, not bullets. Meanwhile, American supply ships, protected by aircraft from Henderson Field, brought in food, ammo, and medicine almost daily. Early in the campaign, especially in August and September, deliveries were interrupted after naval defeats. But by October, supplies were steady again. Marines lived on canned rations that might not have tasted great, but kept them healthy. Ammunition was so plentiful that gunners could fire until barrels wore out and simply request replacements. Medical care was far superior. Field hospitals offered surgeries, blood plasma, and sulfur drugs for infection, while the seriously wounded were evacuated to safer rear bases. Japanese logistics, in comparison, were desperate. Everything had to be carried on destroyers or smuggled through American patrols. Soldiers sometimes made a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that troops were ordered not to fire unless absolutely necessary. Medical treatment often meant a dirty bandage, an amputation without anesthesia, or death from infection. Severely wounded soldiers were sometimes given grenades to take their own lives rather than slow their units down or risk capture. By late October, Japan launched its biggest offensive of the campaign. General Harukichi Hyakutake came to Guadalcanal himself to oversee the attack. He brought battle-hardened troops from China and units from the 2nd Division. The plan called for multiple coordinated assaults, with the main attack once again coming from the south, through dense jungle just like Bloody Ridge. This time, though the Japanese had more men, better coordination, and some artillery finally delivered by destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd with an attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal due to transport problems, crossed the Matanikau River. American defenders, including soldiers from the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank destroyed all 9 Japanese tanks within minutes. The attack collapsed with heavy losses. The main assault came the following night, October 24th to 25th. About 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu advanced from the south, aiming to break through American lines guarding Henderson Field. They ran straight into the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry. The night's fighting became legendary. Japanese waves hit again and again. Each time they broke through, the Marines counterattacked instantly. Machine gunners kept firing until their weapons jammed or burned out, then grabbed rifles and kept fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, shells landing just yards from Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington waited to deliver gunfire support if needed. At one desperate point, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field, but they refused to yield. Sergeant John Basilone, already a hero from Bloody Ridge, once again became vital. When his section ran low on ammo, he personally hauled rounds through enemy fire. He fixed jammed machine guns under fire and led counterattacks with his .45 pistol when positions were overrun. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese assault had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers were lost. American casualties, while several hundred, remained sustainable. October 1942 also brought massive naval clashes that turned the tide around Guadalcanal. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th to 15th, produced some of the fiercest surface fighting in naval history. In a chaotic night battle on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, 2 of the Navy's most respected commanders, were both killed, the only American admirals to die in surface combat during the war. The U.S. lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with 3 more damaged, but the Japanese paid dearly. Hiei was crippled and sunk by air attacks the next day, and the bombardment of Henderson Field never happened. On the night of November 14th-15th, Kirishima tried again but was intercepted by the battleships Washington and South Dakota. Using radar-directed fire, Washington scored 9 hits with its 16-inch guns at ranges so far the Japanese could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with most of her crew. Even more devastating was what happened next. American ships and aircraft destroyed a Japanese convoy carrying the 38th Division and its heavy equipment. Of 11 transports, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and those were bombed and shelled before they could unload. More than 5,000 Japanese soldiers were lost with the convoy. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For the Japanese soldiers still stranded on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had been waiting for reinforcements and supplies, but instead news spread that the naval battles had failed, the convoys were destroyed, and no help was coming. Rations were cut again. Men already starving were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies, already scarce, vanished completely. The sick and wounded crowded into makeshift hospitals where doctors could only watch them die. Captured Japanese diaries from this time described a slow, haunting collapse. Soldiers wrote about eating a single rice ball a day, Disease spreading through the camps, bodies burned only when survivors had the strength, and the growing realization that no more food or medicine would ever arrive. Men resorted to eating grass, bark, even poisonous plants. Once proud soldiers faded into desperate, starving shadows of themselves. By December, Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They couldn't publicly admit defeat, but privately they knew continuing the campaign meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Only about 11,000 men were left out of an original 36,000. Of those, maybe 7,000 could still walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weak from hunger they could barely move. The evacuation, called Operation K, would become one of Japan's few successful operations of the war. Using destroyers in fast nighttime runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese forces managed to pull out 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February, 1943. It was an impressive feat under impossible conditions, but it couldn't hide the scale of the disaster. At their peak, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal numbered about 36,000. Between 25,000 and 30,000 never made it home. Roughly 14,800 were killed in combat, while another 10,000 to 15,000 died from disease and starvation. American losses were also heavy but replaceable. About 1,600 killed, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical illnesses. But America could replace its losses. New divisions were already in training, and ships and planes were rolling off assembly lines faster than they could be destroyed. The strategic tide had permanently turned. For Japan, the psychological blow of Guadalcanal was immense. For the first time, their army had been defeated in prolonged ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactics had ended in catastrophe. The realization that American forces were not only better equipped, but also well-led, disciplined, and capable of enduring brutal conditions shattered their pre-war confidence. Japanese officers who survived the campaign later reflected on the same themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting ability. Second, the gap in logistics and supplies was far greater than anyone had imagined. Third, Japan's logistical system simply wasn't built for a long war against an enemy that controlled both sea and air. And fourth, courage and tactical skill alone could not overcome overwhelming firepower and resources. Veterans who survived Guadalcanal later admitted that their assumptions about warfare had been wrong. They had believed themselves superior, better trained, more disciplined, unafraid of death, masters of night fighting and close combat. But Guadalcanal taught them that wars are won by systems. The Americans had systems for everything: supply, medical care, artillery coordination, and air support, and every one of those systems worked. Japanese systems didn't, because they were never properly built to begin with. Survivors' testimonies directly contradicted Japan's official explanations for the defeat. They admitted that American troops fought superbly at night, especially from fortified positions. They recognized that Americans endured disease and exhaustion, yet kept fighting because their logistics sustained them. They understood that U.S. firepower was coordinated, relentless, and devastating. A single American battalion could unleash more effective fire than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical gap between the two sides was stark. Japanese troops carried bolt-action Arisaka rifles that had to be manually cycled after every shot. U.S. Marines initially used Springfield rifles, but soon received the semi-automatic M1 Garand. Its 8-round clip and rapid-fire capability gave American infantry a clear edge. Machine guns told an even clearer story. The U.S. Browning M19-017A1 was water-cooled and could fire almost indefinitely as long as ammo and water were supplied. Japanese light machine guns like the Type 96 and Type 99 were easier to carry but overheated quickly, fatal in prolonged firefights. Artillery superiority was perhaps the most decisive factor. The 11th Marines used M1A1 pack howitzers, portable 75mm guns that could be broken down and carried through the jungle. Forward observers worked with pinpoint precision, calling in fire missions and getting rounds within minutes. Japanese artillery, by contrast, was scarce, hard to move, and chronically short of shells. Naval gunfire added yet another advantage. U.S. destroyers and cruisers offshore could hammer Japanese positions or provide immediate fire support for troops on the ground. Radio links between spotters on land and ships at sea made targeting frighteningly accurate. And as the campaign dragged on, American air power became dominant. The Cactus Air Force, flying from Henderson Field under brutal conditions, gradually seized control of the skies. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bombers. SPD Dauntless dive bombers pounded Japanese troops' ships and supply dumps. Japanese planes flying from Rabaul had to operate at the edge of their range, leaving them only minutes to strike before turning back. By January 1943, the Americans launched their final offensive. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, attacked in a perfectly coordinated push that crushed the remaining Japanese positions. Artillery, air power, and naval gunfire worked in seamless harmony. Japanese soldiers fought with determination, but starvation, disease, and lack of ammunition doomed them. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese troops had abandoned Guadalcanal. General Patch sent a short but powerful message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has a stop on Guadalcanal. The campaign was finally over. 6 brutal months of combat had ended with America's first major ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it set patterns and revealed truths that would define the rest of the Pacific War. For the Japanese, the lessons from Guadalcanal crushed their pre-war military beliefs. The myth of the unbeatable Japanese warrior was gone. Individual bravery and tactical skill could not overcome larger systemic weaknesses. Night assaults and close-quarters fighting, the same tactics that once brought victory in China, failed miserably against the fortified American positions. Supply lines and logistics proved to be just as vital as courage. Air and naval control decided who won on land. These lessons, paid for in blood and starvation, should have forced Japan to rethink its entire approach to war. Some officers understood this. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who had visited Guadalcanal, later wrote that Japan needed to completely change its strategy. He saw clearly that America was fighting an industrial war, one where factories and resources decided victory. Japan could never outproduce the United States. Yet Japan's military culture, rooted in pride and past success, couldn't accept such a drastic shift. Official reports blamed poor supplies, naval defeats, and stronger-than-expected U.S. defenses. They ignored the truth, that Japan's tactics themselves were outdated. What worked in China had no place in a modern industrial war. Those who survived Guadalcanal became living proof of that painful reality. They arrived as proud soldiers of an invincible empire but left as sick, starving men, broken by defeat. Many later said Guadalcanal was when they first realized Japan would lose the war. Post-war accounts from survivors revealed their change in mindset. They learned what their leaders had denied. The Americans weren't weak. They were organized, well-equipped, and relentless. Japanese soldiers fought bravely, but the Americans fought with a system that worked. Strong logistics, good leadership, and endless supplies. From the American perspective, Guadalcanal proved something crucial. U.S. troops could match and defeat Japan in even the harshest conditions. The myth of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive tactics worked, and coordinated use of air, land, and naval forces proved decisive. American soldiers, well-trained, disciplined, and supplied, showed they could win. Still, U.S. troops came away with respect for their enemy. Japanese soldiers fought to the death, refused surrender, and kept attacking despite starvation and hopeless odds. Their resolve left a deep impression. The stark contrast between the two sides' attitudes toward surrender reflected their cultural divide. Americans dropped leaflets, broadcasted radio messages, and offered food and medical care to encourage surrender. But almost no one accepted. Of about 36,000 Japanese troops, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, most too sick to fight. The impact of Guadalcanal went far beyond one island. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and its forced withdrawal proved that their defensive ring in the Pacific could be broken. The Allies shifted from defense to offense, turning America's industrial power into unstoppable military momentum. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. Their loss of trained men, pilots, and ships could not be replaced. Quietly, Japan had admitted it could not outlast America in a war of attrition. Both sides carried the memory of Guadalcanal for life. U.S. Marines and soldiers who survived became the backbone of new units, teaching the lessons they'd learned about jungle warfare and coordinated combat. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off the island in late 1942, needed months of rest before returning to battle. Japanese survivors faced an even harsher fate, sent to new fronts across the Pacific, haunted by the knowledge that their empire's best days were behind them. Many never lived to see the end of the war. The island itself remained scarred for decades. Wrecked planes, rusting tanks, and unexploded shells scattered across jungles and beaches. Henderson Field grew into a major Allied base for future operations. For historians and strategists, Guadalcanal became a textbook example of modern warfare. Amphibious invasions, jungle combat, air-ground coordination, and naval support all intertwined. The campaign proved that bravery alone wasn't enough. Victory required factories, fuel, planning, and technology. The cost was enormous, over 7,000 Americans and tens of thousands of Japanese dead. Many more suffered from disease and wounds that lasted a lifetime, but militarily, the sacrifice reshaped the Pacific War. Guadalcanal marked the point when the Allies stopped retreating and began to advance. It showed Japan could be beaten, and it set the tone for the brutal island battles yet to come. In the end, Guadalcanal told the story of two opposing visions of war. One believed in spirit and courage overcoming all odds. The other believed in coordination, firepower, and industrial strength. On that island, the second proved victorious. The jungles of Guadalcanal became the place where two opposing military philosophies collided. After 6 months of brutal combat, the outcome made one thing clear: disciplined tactics, steady logistics, and coordinated firepower created a level of military strength the Japanese simply couldn't compete with. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, Guadalcanal marked the moment when illusion gave way to reality. They realized their training was built on false ideas. Their tactics were designed for a different kind of war. Their supplies had been inadequate from the start, and their nation was fighting a battle it could never win through sheer willpower alone. The Americans learned their own lessons. They discovered they could stand toe-to-toe with Japan's most elite fighters in the harshest conditions imaginable. They proved that the United States' massive industrial power could be turned into battlefield victories. They developed new jungle warfare strategies that would serve them throughout the Pacific campaign and destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility. What truly terrified Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal wasn't the individual skill of American troops, though they fought fiercely. It was the relentless, organized, and unstoppable wave of American firepower and supplies. It was the fear born not of death which they had already accepted, but of hopelessness, knowing that bravery meant nothing against an enemy whose guns never went silent, whose planes ruled the skies, and whose factories could replace every loss almost instantly. From that point on, the tide of the Pacific War turned. Japan's forces shifted permanently to the defensive, slowly worn down by an enemy with limitless resources and coordination. The jungle fighting on Guadalcanal became the blueprint for every campaign that followed, proof that, with proper logistics, planning, and overwhelming strength, American forces could win anywhere, no matter how brutal the terrain or how determined the opponent.